Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the February Town Hall of the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice. My name is Charlotte King, and I'm the current chair of the Alliance. And I'm always so happy to have this opportunity to bring a good program to the community and have the community interact with us. I'm not going to talk I'm not going to talk at all about our program. I'm going to leave that up to Don Peterson and the panel. But I did want to make a special point of saying this is Black History Month. And that's a great thing. And it's an opportunity to learn as much as possible. And we've sent you out so many different sites that connect you to the African American Museum. We've sent out a notice that said one of our very own active members, Wayne Paskin, is going to be featured in a program on, let me get the right date, on February 18th at 2:30, given by the Rehoboth Beach History Museum. We also have our own Black History Celebration, which we are co-sponsoring with Camp Rehoboth, and that's going to be on February 18th at 6:30, which is a look at school segregation and why it took so long. What the Alliance is going to try to do is to keep up the conversation. I personally don't believe in celebrating Black history in 1 month, because Black history is American history, and so many of us know so little about that history. And because we don't know about it, we plan poorly for the present, as we can see tonight from your subject, and for the future. So our events, our town hall events, our small meeting events, every month are going to be focused on some aspect of Black history, so that we really can reach our goal of eliminating, hopefully, racism by keeping up the conversation, by making all of us much more aware and educated. Let me end there, but let me encourage all of you. There is something you can do every day during Black History Month. There are that many opportunities out there for you to learn something, even if it's just what's the issue about hair, and why is there a piece of legislation to say you can't discriminate against one's hairstyle. So please try at least every day to find one fact. I'm going to stop because we have a wonderful long program, but I want to introduce Carol Zurich, who wants to spend a moment talking to you about our membership. So, Carol?
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. Yeah, this is, you might call it a public service announcement. You are aware of the wonderful programs that the Alliance puts on and how we've been doing this for the last 5 years. In the last year, we've moved into contributing membership. If you are able to and willing to contribute $25 a year to keep us going, to help us grow so that we know we have a solid base of financial support for our programs, that would be so appreciated. We have a spot on our website where you just need to apply. Once you apply, you'll get a letter from me with some other things in the package, and we would just welcome you as a contributing member moving forward with the Alliance for a mere $25 a month. Having said that, I'm going to introduce Dawn, who is the chair of the Outreach Committee and has arranged this wonderful program as part 2 on race and housing. And as you listen to it, just think about the value that this program brings to your life and how we need your support moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol.
Thanks, Carol. I feel like I'm in the middle of a pledge drive for PBS, but what Carol's saying is very, very important. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening. You might recall that back in November of last year, we began our discussion of housing and how segregation and the lack of access to housing was an intentional effort by federal, state, and local governments. Well, tonight we're going to continue that conversation about the impact of housing issues on communities of color. We're happy tonight especially to partner with the League of Women Voters of Newcastle County in presenting tonight's panel. Before we get into the program, a couple other things I would like to mention to you in terms of future town halls. Besides the Black History event on February 18th that Charlotte mentioned, on March 9th, we're having a town hall called Good Trouble Still Marching. It's going to be on the March of the Pettus Bridge, the life and legacy of John Lewis, and the continuing struggle for voting rights. And then on April 13th, we have something very special planned. Our town hall will be devoted entirely to Black poetry of the 20th century and today. So keep your eyes open for the emails announcing those programs coming out. Well, as we begin tonight's program, Calvin Jackson has once again created a video that really helps to set the stage for tonight's discussion. Following the video, we will turn the proceedings over to our moderator for tonight, Ms. Melody Taylor. Ms. Taylor is the Regional Director of HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity in Philadelphia, and she will introduce tonight's program and the panelists. We will have time for questions towards the end of the program. If you have a question, please type it into the chat, and we will get to as many questions as we can. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Calvin. Thanks.
Mute myself here. Hi and good evening again. I am Melody Taylor. As Don mentioned, I'm the Regional Director for the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. That's my job by day, but at night I try to attempt to find work to do in the community. And as a member of the Newcastle County League of Women Voters, I'm excited and honored to be and to serve as the moderator for this panel this evening. With that being said, this is the Southern Alliance for Racial Justice's Part 2 series on race and housing. That video spoke volume to the universe about the lack of affordable housing, what this country is experiencing currently, but more importantly, what we need to do to address the issues that are affecting our country and affordable housing. In particular, we want to focus tonight on Newcastle County and Sussex County. And to give context to tonight's discussion, I'd like to just frame up some of the issues that will examine the acute shortage of affordable housing opportunities and the racial injustices that contribute to severely constraining housing choices, which perpetuate segregation and poverty. In fiscal year 2020, the Delaware State Housing Authority, Newcastle County, Kent County, Sussex County actually embarked upon what's called an analysis of impediments. An analysis of impediments is purposed to assist states and localities and housing authorities in conducting a thorough examination of structural barriers to fair housing choice based on protected classes. We look at factors that contribute to those barriers and processes for prioritizing, planning, and addressing those barriers that have been identified. Additionally, it requires that a jurisdiction or consortium take meaningful actions to overcome historic patterns of segregation, promote fair housing choice, and foster inclusive communities. Tonight, our panelists are going to embark upon sharing experiences and give us a deep dive into the numbers, the statistics that were provided in that analysis of impediments, but also to provide some solutions to how we can address the lack or the shortage of affordable housing. I think I would be remiss if I didn't lift up the issues that are affecting this country currently as it relates to the pandemic and the notion that it has exacerbated the issues of race and racism in housing in the state and throughout the country. So just a few statistics of note. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has seen an increase in sexual harassment cases. So women and children are being sexually harassed more now that the pandemic has hit. People can't afford their rent. And so landlords have now petitioned themselves or petitioned women who are single family headed of households, sex in exchange for rent. We've seen that happen throughout the country. The increased unemployment has exacerbated the eviction crisis. In particular, if you have an opportunity to look at Princeton's Eviction Lab, they provide very specific data on census tracts and information about evictions that are happening. Evictions was a crisis prior to the pandemic, but now that the pandemic has hit, we've seen an increased number of calls where people are now being evicted. And in particular in the state of Delaware, the Princeton statistics show that 5.1%, which is about 2 points higher than the national average, is impacting the state of Delaware. So when we layer onto those statistics, patterns of segregation and the lack of affordable housing, we are in a crisis. The state of Delaware, Newcastle County, Sussex County, we are in a state of crisis. And although sometimes the data may not fully flush out the issues, the anecdotal accounts, the stories, the pain that people are suffering from as it relates to the lack of affordable housing is a real, alive, and a true issue. So our panel of experts will take a deeper dive into sharing information regarding the AI. They're going to talk to us about how discrimination manifests itself in the placement or the resistance to developing affordable housing, and look to provide solutions in which organizations such as Habitat for Humanity is piloting to address the issues. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists. I'm going to start with Sara Pratt, who is counsel at Relman and Colfax. Sara joined the firm in 2015 after her retirement from the federal government. She's actually my ex-boss and a dear friend to me and mentor throughout my fair housing career. So that's a shameless plug I'm giving you, Sara. Her civil rights litigation practice focuses on challenges to institutional barriers to access to housing, lending, and insurance, and to policies and practices that perpetuate segregation based on race, national origin, disability. I think it's of important note, Sara represented fair housing organizations across the country in filing a lawsuit against the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Yes, I did.
For suspending the implementation of a rule that increased access to rental housing for Section 8 vouchers. So let's welcome Sara.
Thanks.
We
Thank you,
have
Melody.
Sara's on our panel, Sara Pratt, and we have Sara Watson. So I will refer to them as SP and SW tonight. Sara Watson, who is Associate Counsel with Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and Fair Housing and Community Development Project. Prior to assuming her role as the Associate Counsel, Sara was the George Lindsay Fellow, where she used a three-pronged approach of impact litigation, local advocacy, and community engagement to challenge the discriminatory effects of nuisance and crime-free ordinances on minorities and victims of domestic violence. Notably for Sara Watson, SW, Sara was very intimately involved in working with the state and the jurisdictions on the development of the 2020 analysis of impediments. And so the data, the community engagement, the task force, Sara was intimately involved in working with those groups and will bring really good information to the panel tonight. And last but not least, Katy Millard, who has been with Habitat for Humanity, welcome Katy, for over 10 years and is currently the Director of Development and Advocacy at Sussex County Habitat for Humanity. At Sussex County Habitat, Katy advocates to increase access to safe, decent, and affordable housing in Sussex County and throughout the state of Delaware. So welcome, Katy. And so I'd like to get started. We're going to have Sara Watson give us some additional framework surrounding the analysis of impediments and some of the data in which was determined in the state surrounding affordable housing and the lack of support affordable housing. My apologies.
Thank you so much, Melody. It's great to be here. We've got a lot of information to share, but we're also really excited to hear your questions and answer all of your questions. So as Melody mentioned, I worked on the analysis of impediments. It took us about 2 years, and I drove the transmission out of my car, driving back and forth to Delaware. So I'm very excited to be doing this panel without having to make that 3-hour drive. But I'm really, really excited to be here. And so I put together a slideshow that covers just what the analysis of impediments is, some of the findings that we found during our course of study, and also highlighted some of the recommendations that we made that were specific to Sussex County and Newcastle County. So Calvin, if you could pull up the slideshow, that would be great. Okay. So we can just go ahead and skip that first slide. Already covered that. So most people, I'm sure you all had the first part of this town hall, so I'm sure most people are aware of the Fair Housing Act. And the Fair Housing Act generally prohibits discrimination in real estate related transactions or transactions related to the sale, rental, and financing of dwellings on the basis of various protected classes. And those include race, color, religion, sex, familial status, national origin, and disability. So this is the discrimination that we're talking about. Generally, the Fair Housing Act is what you would think of as rental discrimination or housing discrimination. You know, redlining, refusing to rent or sell your house to a person of color, those kinds of things, or the sexual harassment that Melody was talking about earlier. But a lot of people aren't aware that the Fair Housing Act also has what we call the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule that's embedded within the statute. And that requirement essentially says that it's not enough for HUD to just take steps to prohibit discrimination or try to hold individual actors or jurisdictions accountable for overt housing discrimination. It also requires HUD to administer all of its programs and activities. That includes grant funds that it makes to different actors and organizations in a manner that affirmatively furthers the policy of this act. And so this is where the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing rule was created. And essentially, it's taken different forms since the passage of the Fair Housing Act, but the current version, well, I'll say the second to last version, not taking into account President Trump's attempt to suspend the rule, but essentially the rule requires that jurisdictions undergo a fair housing audit. And it's been called analysis of impediments and assessment of fair housing, but essentially HUD is asking any jurisdiction that receives a certain amount of funds to go through and identify barriers to housing in their jurisdiction and take active steps to remedy that discrimination. And so the most recent iteration required jurisdictions to do this audit every 5 years in conjunction with a consolidated plan, action plans, and public housing authority plans. So it's really a planning rule that assesses what each jurisdiction has done in the past 5-year period or the past period since the last analysis of impediments, identify any existing barriers, identify any new barriers that have come up, and then set recommendations that they plan to act on in the next cycle. So it's really designed to set up a framework for taking meaningful action to actually increase housing opportunity, to build more affordable housing, to reduce segregation, and all of these more kind of lofty goals that were embedded in the Fair Housing Act beyond just prohibiting overt discrimination. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we spent a lot of time working on this analysis of impediments. It's a statewide one, so it included all 3 counties in Delaware. We looked statewide, we looked at the entire Philadelphia, Delaware region. We looked at all 3 counties, Wilmington and Dover, and Newark as the 3 cities as well, individually. So that includes looking at a lot of data. HUD has an incredible amount of data, maps, tables. We also looked at local statistics, local data, anything from the populations living in public housing in Delaware to community legal aid societies data on what kind of housing complaints they were seeing the most of, to what the Delaware Attorney General's Office and Civil Rights Division were finding. We looked at everything. We also analyzed statewide, county, and local policies for any policies that might be having either a direct or indirect effect on access to housing for people throughout the state. In addition to analyzing an absolute ton of data, we also did extensive community engagement throughout the entire state. So that included focus groups with people who worked kind of on similar issues. We conducted individual meetings. And you can see on the slide, we really tried to cover the entire gamut of people who even remotely touched housing. So that's government agencies and departments, community organizations, residents, regular residents, residents of public housing, social service providers, housing and homelessness services, landlords, etc. We tried to cover it all to really get a full picture. And so if you think about data as kind of black and white, community engagement is really the color that brings the full picture together so that we can see what people are facing and make recommendations that are actually going to help people in their day-to-day. We also conducted community meetings in all 3 of the counties, and we also presented a draft and held a public hearing and opened that draft for public comment in all 3 of the counties as well. So people were able to come to community meetings, submit their feedback, and we incorporated that into the final draft that was commissioned by the Delaware State Housing Authority and the consortium of county and city officials that were working on this. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give some examples of the data that we were looking at. So these are HUD maps for Sussex and Newcastle County. And these are dot density maps where each dot represents, each color dot represents different races. So we're able to use these maps to create an underlying idea of where groups are clustered, where groups might be segregated, and then we can use additional data to overlay on top of these maps. So we could overlay a school proficiency index map and see where the highest access to proficient schools is and whether that overlaps with any racial or ethnic groups. So if you can see on the Sussex County map, most of the population is gathered along the beach area, not surprising for those of you who live in Sussex County. We also have some towards the north and a little here on the western side. And you can see that some groups of communities of color are grouped towards the center of Sussex County and to the west as well. In Newcastle County, again, I'm sure it's unsurprising to those who live there, but you can see these green dots represent the Black population, who are extremely concentrated in this top right area, which is Wilmington. And we can also see that the Black population is sprinkled throughout kind of the central area of the region there, and far less concentrated in the southern half of Newcastle County. So this is just to provide an example of the types of maps we look at. The final AI includes hundreds of pages of different maps if you're a map or data type person, to look through and see, look at where you live, or where you're interested in looking, and you can see the type of data that we analyze to come up with our findings. Next slide, please. And I see that someone posted a question of where you can find it. I believe it's on, if you look at the Delaware State Housing Authority's website, I believe it's there, and it may be other places as well, but I know for sure that it's. Another thing that we look at are called recaps, and recaps is an acronym for racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. And so these are areas, one census tract, where the minority population is more than 60%, and the poverty rate is extremely high as well. So these are areas of high concentration and high poverty rates. So there are 5 recaps throughout the city, throughout the state of Delaware. 4 of them are in Wilmington. And you can see, if we were to overlay that with the race and ethnicity map, this would include areas that are heavily concentrated with the city's Black population. Dover has the other recap. I know that's not in Newcastle or Sussex, but I wanted to include it to show where the other recap is. Next slide, please. And then we have, like I said, we overlay the race and ethnicity maps with all types of different indexes that we can use to evaluate access to opportunity. So I wanted to include the transit map specifically because in the community engagement that we did, one of the things that we consistently heard from folks in Sussex County was how bad public transit access is. We heard people saying that they sometimes had to wait an hour to take a bus to get to one of their health appointments or to get to work, or if they missed the one bus for the day, they're done for the rest, they have to wait until tomorrow to go do whatever they had to do. So this is a map of what we call the low cost transportation index, which measures how much access people have to low-cost public transportation that can take them where they need to go. And this can show us, if you looking at this map, considering other factors, we can think about what that means in relation to transportation, what that means in relation to school, what that means in relation to employment. If people don't have the access to transportation to get to those things, they're significantly lacking an opportunity to be able to access things that they need to make a life. So if these maps are interesting too, because they're color coordinated by shade. So the darker shades on the map correspond to a higher low-cost transportation index or higher access to low-cost transportation. And you can see that the entire county for Newcastle is significantly darker than almost the entire county for Sussex County. So already there, we're seeing some disparities across the state. And also notably is that despite being more segregated in areas, Newcastle County has relatively equal access to transportation throughout. So that's not one of our indicators of disparate access to opportunity, even though there might be disparate access to other things, such as school proficiency. Throughout the county, it's pretty equalized in terms of access to transportation. Similarly, in Sussex County, there's pretty low access to transportation across the board, but you can see there are some areas in the central western area and kind of smack dab in the middle of the county that have slightly higher access. But overall, we heard that access to transportation is extremely, extremely difficult in Sussex County. So that was one thing that really informed our findings as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so I tried to summarize as best that we could in terms of the kind of the major hits that we found. So in Sussex County, like I said, we heard that there's the least amount of access to public transportation of all 3 counties. We heard that consistently. We heard that from individual residents. We heard that from service providers, that it was difficult for them to get their folks to services, to have their folks get to them, to receive referrals to services. So public transportation was a big one. We also found that there were some localized effects of environmental health hazards. So on the county as a whole had lower access, had lower scores in the environmental health index overall compared to some of the other counties. But there were areas, particularly in some of the poultry plants, that were polluting, creating pollution in the runoff water and stuff like that, where we saw there were some localized effects throughout the county of environmental health problems. We also saw racial disparities in access to water and sewer hookups in rural areas of the county. And particularly Hispanic households in the county were hit particularly hard with housing issues. They have the high overcrowding rates that are double that of the statewide average. And they're also the only racial and ethnic group in the county that's more likely to rent instead of own their own homes. So any of these policies that we're seeing that may have a negative impact on renters are going to hit Hispanic households the most. Additionally, there was a concentration of affordable and accessible units for people with disabilities in racially segregated areas. And this is one thing that I believe Sara is going to talk about a lot, but it's one thing in the fair housing world that we're always talking about. Affordable housing, and particularly affordable housing that's accessible, is almost always concentrated away from areas of high opportunity. And so that's one thing that everybody is trying to fix a lot of the time, is making sure that affordable housing comes with choice. Additional affordable housing comes with choice to live where you want in areas that provide you with the things that you want. In Newcastle County, some similarities, some differences. It's the most populous county, the most diverse county. And since we did an analysis from 1990, and there's a rapidly increasing population of people of color. So it's the most diverse and getting more diverse as we go. There's relatively equal access to transit, as we covered. The Black residents tend to have lower access to employment opportunities, and almost all the affordable housing in the county is concentrated in racially segregated areas, particularly in Wilmington. In Wilmington specifically, there's extremely high levels of segregation, including the 4 out of 5 of the state's recaps. The school proficiency index scores were significantly lower. There's a significantly aging affordable housing stock. So not only are we talking about not enough access to affordable housing, not enough physical units, but the affordable housing units that exist are aging and not being maintained. And we also saw very low environmental health scores in Newcastle County. So that's kind of an overview of the data that we looked at, the process that we went through to evaluate all of this data, and kind of the highlights of what we found. And so from that and our community engagement, we narrowed down some goals and strategies that each jurisdiction could take to address these barriers. So the next couple of slides, there's a lot of text on there. I won't read it word for word, but as I mentioned, you can find the executive summary and the full document online. But I wanted to highlight some of the things that we recommended, and then I think that'll flow nicely into Sara P's talk about some of the resistance that jurisdictions might find as they try to implement these things.
Great, thanks, Sara. What we will do is to make sure that the link to the study, I will include that in the chat box so that everyone will have access to the information. And just to set the framework for the discussion, we're going to allow each panelist to speak, and then we'll open it up for questions on the tail end, so we'll get through the presentations. So Sara Pratt, if you could kick us off on affordable housing, why affordable housing is placed where it is, and what is some of the community resistance as it relates to affordable housing?
Thanks, Melody, and thanks everybody for having me and be a part of such an interesting panel. I have to say, as I start, that when I was at HUD, it was my privilege to work on both the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing role and the sort of framework or template for the assessment of fair housing. It was a lot of hard work and a lot of thought that went into it, but when I see the report done for the state of Delaware, I have to say how grateful I am that there were strong people to pull all the pieces together and make such a wonderful product. You guys should be very grateful for the leadership that has been shown in developing and adopting this document. However, I can love it all I want to, but the question is, what's going to be done with it? How are you going to operationalize this? How are you going to prevent displacement of people of color? How are you going to strengthen and rebuild areas that are now currently segregated racially and poor? How are you going to find opportunities for affordable housing and overcome likely community opposition to that housing? So operationalizing the analysis of impediments is really critically important. It's going to take help from everybody listening to my voice tonight and a lot of other people. I've worked on fair housing for 44 years. I started in Kentucky a long time ago, obviously, when I was 6, I always say. But I started out in small towns in Kentucky, and I learned a lot about segregation in those small towns of Kentucky. I learned about public housing authorities that were racially segregated and where the folks where the Black people lived were always in worse shape. And I worked in Kentucky, where the first case that I ever worked on as a young lawyer was a case where a county had planned a road, and they have paved it through the white part of the community and stopped the paving just past the white church before you got to the part of the road that led to the Black community and the Black church. So racial inequities were built into our systems. As you heard last November, if you read Richard Rothstein's book, or if you just look around and know anything about the history of your state, you know that racial exclusion and segregation was baked into our state, and that undoing it is not going to be just a let's make a plan and it's going to be beautiful and it's miraculously going to happen, because building a focus, building attention to what needs to be done, turning up, turning out, when there is a local community organizing around these issues, and targeting the activities that need to occur to implement this beautiful plan are all really important. And unless you first engage, and secondly, bring partners to the table who will help you engage, that you don't want the analysis of impediments to be a beautiful piece of paper and a work of art that everybody will say, what a lovely thing, but that never comes to fruition in your state, and it needs to. So analysis of impediments is a planning process. I will say that and recognize that, and that it is used as a framework behind which people organize to fight both the fight on changing structural things, like how decisions are made, or what zoning looks like, if that happens to be an issue, or what the plans are to invest in communities of color and rebuild them and strengthen them. And it's also around individual actions, things that might be occurring while the analysis of impediments is in play. So it helps you make a decision about what to do in that particular case. But I'm also a lawyer. And I have to say that sometimes there are individual civil rights violations that are really important that occur in particular circumstances that require enforcement attention. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, then I'm going to go back to the planning process. The reason why I say that is because sometimes the planning process is implemented by people who are not strong enough to make sure that the decisions that are made are consistent with the plan. I've learned this. I bring you a national perspective. I can tell you there's no shame in it. It happens everywhere. But it's a community's job to make sure that their elected officials and that their decision makers on all kinds of things, get with the plan, and that they follow the plan, and that they take actions that are consistent with the plan. Enforcement can play a role in that. And to illustrate that, I want to tell you about a town called Coal Run, community called Coal Run, which is part of a larger town in Ohio. In the Coal Run community, which was surrounded basically by white neighborhoods, the Coal Run community was a community mostly of people of color. And the rest surrounding community had public water, and Coal Run for many, many, many years, generations in fact, never had public water supply. It never had sewer lines. They got their water from wells or from rain barrels. And the reason behind this was, in fact, long ago racial discrimination and decision-making that was continued for many years that brought white people city water and Black people no city water. My law firm, before I joined my law firm, filed a lawsuit against the community saying that this violated the Fair Housing Act because it discriminated in the availability of municipal services based on race. So enforcement is a role that can be played here. The enforcement occurred only after many years of asking politely, or maybe even not so politely, for town water and not getting it. So you have entrenched patterns of housing discrimination and segregation in your state, and you have opportunities now to make changes. So enforcement is a tool like any other tool. Sometimes maybe enforcement will be necessary, and maybe it won't be at all because everything will go smoothly. But Coal Run is my example, or one of my many examples about what it took to get a community to make changes. Change doesn't always come easily to communities. Community opposition lines itself up to say, we like things the way they are. We don't want to make change, and even to be kind of bullies about it and to say and do things that are clearly racist or intuitively racist through the use of code words and, as they say, dog whistle politics. And so community opposition is actionable under the Fair Housing Act, less against the individuals who express personal opinions, but certainly against elected officials and planning people who do not comply with the Fair Housing Act. But probably as important as anything else is the idea that of the importance of getting the community on board with the direction you're going in. Having people understand, for one thing, that your answer to an area that is racially segregated and poor is not to bring in the bulldozers, but to strengthen the communities of color, right? To strengthen them, to build them up, to make them an active part of the community, to provide perhaps choices there in terms of housing opportunities, in terms of different financial opportunities, but provide infrastructure, access to better schools, community support for commercial and retail services in the neighborhoods. So you build up existing communities of color and strengthen them, just like Cold Run, which eventually got its public water. But at the same time, you make housing choices available elsewhere by deciding and paying attention to where the needs are, where are the needs for affordable housing, who are the communities that need affordable housing, and looking at siting decisions that will maximize housing choices across the community. In either environment, you may run into community opposition, but it takes kind of a critical mass of people working together as advocates to understand the framework so that you know what the analysis of impediments say, that are willing to hold elected and appointed decision makers accountable through the analysis of impediments and planning process to ensure the implementation of these important principles, and also who are not unwilling, if necessary, to use your enforcement ability. I will say that having HUD looking over your shoulder is always a good thing, and it's probably a better thing now than it was, say, I don't know, a year ago. But HUD cannot be everywhere. I mean, HUD was in Sussex County when Stick built affordable housing that was designed to people who worked in Rehoboth Beach but could not afford to live there, needed a place to buy a house. And HUD and Melody Taylor took the lead on that approach to make that housing opportunity with Diamond State Land Trust come to fruition. So HUD is there as well, but HUD can't be everywhere. You folks listening to me and others who are your friends and your allies and your collaborators who have similar goals and similar missions or overlapping missions and goals, you guys are the ones who can pull together to first counter the community opposition by more education, by holding people accountable to following the analysis of impediments, to being there to lend your voices to the support for the affordable housing choice, for the options for people, to how you're going to serve people who are Spanish speakers in their community, to how you're going to serve people with disabilities, to how you're going to make housing opportunity real for everyone in these areas where you live. You're the ones. You're the people. I'm looking forward to hearing your voices. Now I'm going to pull it back over to someone else to talk about some other issues that are related to affordable housing needs across this area.
And so we're going to turn it over to Katy to talk a bit more about your involvement as a task force member in the development of the 2020 AI, but to also talk to us a bit about Habitat for Humanity and some of the solutions that the organization has provided to contribute to the supply of affordable housing.
And thank you so much for having me. And Calvin, I don't know if you want to put up the slides. Perfect. Great. Perfect. And again, thank you so much for having me. My name is Katy Millard, and I'm the Director of Development and Advocacy at Sussex County Habitat for Humanity. And today, like Melody said, I'm going to talk a little bit about what affordable housing is, why it's important, a little bit about the housing landscape in Sussex County and in the state, and some current advocacy that's happening at the local, state, and federal levels to increase access to safe, decent, and affordable homes. And a lot of the housing statistics in this presentation are blanket statistics for the county, in Sussex County. The number of studies and resources to show inequality outside of the analysis of impediments, especially in Sussex County, is lacking, but we do know that BIPOC residents are more likely to negatively be impacted by high housing costs, systemic patterns of segregation, and most recently by COVID-19. If we simply look at wage, Black households have a median household income of $24,000 less than white households, at $42,000 versus $66,000. Additionally, people of color are more likely to live in communities with poverty rates over 20%. And these disparities continue statewide. So if we look at Wilmington and Newcastle County, Black and Hispanic households have a median income of approximately $30,000, which is half of the median income for white families. The homeownership gap is also large, which leads to a wealth gap fueled by lower homeownership rates. And why is that? It's because of access to housing and lack of access to housing, specifically affordable housing, and specifically in areas of opportunity. Speaking of affordable housing, what exactly is affordable housing? So simply put, affordable housing is when you pay 30% or less of your income towards your housing costs. For renters, this is your monthly rent. For homeowners, it includes your mortgage, your taxes, your insurance, and lot rent or HOA fees if that's applicable. And affordability can be based simply on market cost of a home or an apartment, or it can be subsidized to increase the affordability of the unit. Calvin, if you go to the next slide. But affordability is out of reach for many. In the United States, 1 in 6 households spends half or more of their income on housing, and a disproportionate number of these households are households of color. And why should you care about this? Could you go to the next slide, please? Oh, there you go. So let's look at 2 scenarios and consequences for unaffordability. So a single mother who earns minimum wage, who spends half or more of her income on housing, has only $124 per week, or $17 a day to spend on all other necessities after paying rent. Also, on average, a cost-burdened renter had less than $10 in savings in 2015. And after the COVID-19 crisis, I can't imagine that that's gotten any better. High housing cost burdens lead to difficult decisions. With $17 a day, how do you pay for food, medical care, utilities, clothing, and transportation? You probably can't. Building more affordable housing creates sustainability. Next slide, please. And that's why housing matters, because it builds stronger families, it builds more equitable and inclusive communities, and it also creates a better local economy. So when we invest and we support diverse businesses and we are able to attract and retain workers, it's good for everyone. Affordable housing is really win-win. So it's always, affordable housing really is a wonderful solution. Next slide, please. So almost 2 years ago now, County Council hired an affordable housing consultant to perform a study on housing in the county and to make recommendations on how to improve it. And surprise, there was not enough affordable housing in Sussex County. Next slide, please. So this slide here is from the home study, which was done by that consultant, and it shows the top industries in Sussex County and their average wage. And if you look at the corresponding affordable rent and mortgage amounts, you can see that it would be difficult to find affordable housing in the county at these affordable levels. And it's also important to keep in mind that this affordable homeownership level it assumes that 2 people in that household are working. A lot of times there's only 1 person in that household who are working. So this level is also out of reach. It was also found that in the home study, which was done in May of 2019, 80% of homes for sale were single family homes, and only 13% of homes listed were under $200,000. But 1/3 of jobs in Sussex County pay wages that can only afford homes up to $200,000. But even within this larger context of unaffordability, there are different realities that people experience when it comes to housing. So households of color face higher housing cost burdens. Housing cost burden is when you pay more than 30% of your income towards your housing. An estimated 62% of Hispanic renters are cost burdened, and 42% of Black renters are cost burdened, compared to 37% of white renters and 38% of renters of all other races. Hispanic and Black households are also more likely than white households to be renters, and this includes being cost burden renters. While the homeownership rate among white households is about 83% and consistent with the county rate of 82%, only about half of Hispanic households are homeowners and 57% of Black households are homeowners. One especially impactful statistic from the analysis of impediments is that in Sussex County, while 61.5% of white home loan applicants were approved between 2014 and 2017, only 38% of Black applicants were approved. In Newcastle County, that number is 67% and 54%. This disparity leads to inequalities in who can afford homes and who owns their own home, who rents, and who pays affordable amounts towards their housing. Next slide, please. And it's often suggested in Sussex that people just simply move west to lower their housing costs. But while housing costs might be slightly cheaper west of the coast, the transportation costs to get to jobs raises that cost burden for households. So if you look at this slide, the left heat map shows housing cost burden alone. The right heat map shows the cost burden of housing and transportation combined. On average, Sussex Countyans spend about 56% of their income on housing and transportation. The commonly accepted affordability threshold is 45%. Next slide, please. And then one last statistic that I wanted to include is that the study told us that by 2050, we needed to build an additional 7,000 units for households making less than 80% of area median income. Area median income is based on the county, and it's kind of how it is determined who qualifies for certain programs. So for extremely low income households, and that means that households who make less than 30% of area median income, there are 38 affordable rentals for every 100 families across the state. And this disproportionately affects Black households. According to the analysis of impediments, almost 70% of households in affordable rental apartments are Black. And it's important to offer affordable housing opportunities to all income levels. So this includes rental units, shelters for individuals and families experiencing homelessness, supportive units, housing options for recently incarcerated individuals, and other options, including accessory dwelling units and home repairs, especially for homeowners who are in affordable conditions now, but are potentially going to get into poor housing conditions in the future. Next slide, please. So, let's get to solutions, right? There is no silver bullet to solve the affordability crisis. Many different approaches are going to have to be used so that they can work together on many different fronts. If you think back to that home study that I was just talking about, they made 3 recommendations. That included creating a housing trust fund, modifying zoning codes to promote housing affordability in growth areas, and preserve existing housing stock of affordable housing. And this includes preventing displacement, and this is also known as gentrification. So the county actually included a trust fund in their fiscal year 21 budget to help build and incentivize affordable housing. But with COVID, all new initiatives were halted. But we will continue to advocate so that they revisit the trust fund and pass it as soon as possible. Zoning is also a major factor in contributing to unaffordability and segregated housing. Building higher density properties allows for more affordable units due to the economies of scale. And we're also beginning to work on existing ordinances that incentivize the construction of affordable units in both new rental and home ownership projects. Right now, the rental program has only been used once. The home ownership ordinance has never been used, and they are almost 15 years old. So we need to make sure that these ordinances are used more so that we can increase the amount of affordable units created by developers. Newcastle County is actually working on some innovative projects, and I want to highlight the Hope Center, which is a former Sheraton hotel that's being used as an emergency shelter. They're using the conference rooms to do supportive services and are providing transportation to the residents. The first night that it was open, the shelter was filled to capacity. The need is there. Additionally, there's many other advocacy efforts at state level. So Community Legal Aid Society, which is also known as CLASSY, is spearheading legislation to give a right to counsel to all renters being taken before court for eviction. This would help prevent evictions simply by allowing renters access to legal aid. There's also work being done right now to include housing vouchers as a protected class of income for renters. Right now, that's not the case, and people can be turned away simply for trying to use housing vouchers. I think it's also important to talk a little bit about issues that are related to housing, but not necessarily about housing affordability. It was brought up earlier, quality of water, quality of transportation. There's also something down here, especially in Sussex County. During COVID, many people were able to work from home or safely switch to virtual and homeschooling. However, that was not the case for everybody. 16% of Black residents do not have access to the internet, and 14% do not have access to a computer. This number is 7% for white residents. So Delaware stated that they will be using CARES Act money to expand internet access in the state, which is very exciting, but we have to keep on them, right? So like Sara said earlier, we have great plans, but we have to make sure that they are implemented. So we have to make sure that we advocate to ensure that that actually goes forward. So there's also one other thing that I wanted to bring up that's new legislation, hasn't been introduced yet, but hopefully it will give more rights to manufactured homeowners. That is one aspect of affordable housing that is prevalent, especially down in Sussex County. And there are many rights that need to be worked on for manufactured homeowners. Next slide, please. So a quick note about federal policy. This is for Habitat for Humanity. Every year, hundreds of Habitat advocates go to Washington, D.C. to advocate for federal housing policy. And this week is called Habitat on the Hill, and it just so happens that it is this week. So it is a week of advocacy for me. If you can go to the next slide. This year, we are asking for 3 separate federal asks. So we are asking for mortgage assistance for low-income homeowners at risk of foreclosure due to the pandemic, and that should be included in any future recovery package. Support of the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, and support for housing and community development federal programs. And one thing I did want to point out in the community development federal program is the USDA 502 direct loan program, which could be used as an affordable loan product for home ownership. The last COVID package actually included rental insurance, or rental assistance, which is very important, but it did not include mortgage assistance. So those 2 things need to go hand in hand. According to the Brookings Institute, COVID has exacerbated housing inequality, with Black and Hispanic households more likely to be evicted, delinquent on mortgage payments, and behind on utilities. And we need to make sure that these families don't get left behind, and that we help ensure that we don't lose homeowners after the pandemic. And we also need to invest in communities of color. So we have to invest with the community. And the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act could potentially provide some tax credits, which would allow to build affordable units in communities. But we also have to make sure that we work with the community. So community organizing, community planning, these are 2 of the most effective ways to bring opportunity and investment. And we need to engage and make sure that the residents are a part of the process. Next slide, please. So what can you do, right? So what are the advocacy takeaways for this from my little portion? I have 3 really easy advocacy facts, and these are for Sussex County, but if anybody wants them, I can get them for Newcastle or for Kent. And these just show the need for housing in the county. So we have really talked about this before. 1 in 7 households in Sussex County pay more than 50% of their income on housing. Affordable housing is important because it's an economic driver, a workforce development tool, an equity driver, and a community development tool. And right now, people cannot live where they work in Sussex County. On average, people in Sussex County pay 56% of their income on their housing and transportation costs. So these are just some, and again, not all. There are a lot of facts out there that we need to make sure that people are getting. But these are 3 quick and easy facts that if you want to pepper them into conversation, especially if you are ever speaking with anybody who is an elected official, that would be great. So you can also reach out to me, and I'm sure any of the other the presenters, to discuss affordable housing. And hopefully everybody will start becoming an advocate, because there's always work to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. That was comprehensive information. And I think you bring up a very important point. As I'm a native Delawarean, and I've spent time having these conversations, but the advocacy fact sheet is really important.
Mm-hmm.
Delaware is a small state, right? And there has to be a collective conversation with one agenda. There are many competing factors, agencies that have competing priorities, but at some point, Habitat, Pathways to Success,
Mm-hmm.
The Alliance for Social Justice, League of Women Voters, we all have to come together with one voice and one agenda in order to affect systemic change. If we're
Absolutely,
nothing's going to be done.
mm-hmm.
I'm probably dating myself here because I'm still a very young woman. But in 1998 and 2003, 2011, I worked on each one of those analyses of impediments for the state. And consistently in each one of those documents, what was highlighted was the lack of affordable housing, patterns of segregation, communities that were unincorporated, that lacked access to water, communities that lacked access to public service. So here we are, 2021, and we're still seeing these same issues. So at some point, we have to collectively figure out, how do we address it? So Sara Pratt talked about enforcement, and that HUD can't be everywhere. So HUD was instrumental in filing the complaint on behalf of Diamond State Community Land Trust against Sussex County. A compliance review was ensued against Delaware State Housing Authority. And out of that process came a what's called a voluntary compliance agreement. It was a document that required the state and Sussex County to do certain things, right? There were terms and conditions. So that ended, and so too did a lot of activity. And so I say all that to say, how can the Alliance, the League, Habitat, other organizations organize around these issues? And Sarah Watson, I know that you have a background in helping communities organize. Can you give some recommendations about how that can happen? And then talk a little bit more about how residents can contribute to this bigger conversation, right? The state creates this consolidated plan. There are all these statistics out there. How can residents, how can these organizations contribute to this conversation to bring about change?
Sure. I think as the other Sara eloquently put it, you have to work together. And I think part of the issue, and one of the things that we're seeing, I think in this current moment, is that it's not enough for people who are the most directly affected by these policies to be the ones speaking up. And often, as Katie was saying, you have people who are working multiple jobs to not even be able to afford their rent. They're trying to put food on the table, support their kids and all of that. They may not have time to go to a community meeting and tell their elected officials what they need from housing policy, but a lot of other people do. The other 6 out of 7 people in Sussex County who are not housing cost burden can make that advocacy ask on behalf of their community. This really has to be a community effort, not only because you have elected officials who will use the community as a way to not produce affordable housing or not pass these things. We've all heard the excuses used by elected officials. Oh, the community doesn't want more traffic. The community is worried about safety. The community is worried about any number of imaginary risks that come from affordable housing. But those people who are vocal about those things are the ones that always show up. The squeaky wheel, it makes the most noise. They're the ones who are at every single public meeting telling elected officials, this is what we don't want, this is what we don't want. This really has to be a community effort saying, we want people in our communities to have choice. We want people in our communities to not have to choose between paying their utilities and paying their rent. We want people to be able to afford to work where they live. All of these things are asks that have to be made as part of a larger community organizing effort. So I think, the fact that you all have 80 people on this call tonight is a testament to the community of racial justice advocates that you have here in Sussex County and the rest of the state who are committed to housing issues. and you have to hold people accountable. So I think the analysis of impediments, I'm a little biased because I wrote a lot of it, but I think there are a lot of good recommendations. And Katy highlighted a lot of things that we had as recommendations in the AI. I think right to counsel is extremely important in eviction proceedings, especially now with all the people who are facing eviction in terms of COVID. We also recommended things like capping rental fees. We heard a lot about people applying to 7 or 8 places and being denied, maybe because they have a voucher or for other reasons, and now they're out hundreds of dollars and still don't have a place to live. We recommended, particularly in Sussex County, moving to moving away from complaint-based code enforcement systems. We heard a lot of people are intimidated by their landlords out of making complaints about their substandard housing, particularly in undocumented communities, being threatened with legal enforcement because they make a complaint about something dangerous in their home. If you move to a regular inspection cycle instead of just focusing on complaints as people are made, then those types of issues can be found through regular enforcement. And absolutely, protections for manufactured home communities was at the top of our list, particularly for Sussex County. So I think there are, like everybody's been saying, there are a lot of strategies that can be taken, but you have to show up and you have to be loud, because the opposition, even if they're a small number of people, they're always loud and they're always acting like they represent the rest of the community. And people who care about racial justice, people who care about access to housing and making sure that families have everything that they need to show up and be vocal and say, this is what we want. This is what we want our community to look like. The last thing I'll say is that as I was a debater in high school, we were always taught, find what people care about. So sometimes people don't care about racial justice, and that's a sad thing to say, but that's not always good enough to move the needle. So you have to find what people care about to help them. And one thing that, was really striking to me throughout the community development community engagement process, we heard a lot from employers, even social service providers, who said, we can't retain staff. Housing costs have gotten so high that we cannot effectively recruit and retain staff. So maybe you go to your elected official and say, do you see all our social service offices? There's a high turnover because people can't afford to live here. Do you want our social services to be effective? We need to work on housing prices so that people can see that Delaware is a place that they can come and raise their families and they can live. Same with legal service providers. It costs a lot of money these days to go to law school. If you've got loans, it's not effective to live in a place. Well, I said this as I live in DC, but it's not necessarily always effective to move somewhere where you have high housing costs, especially if you're trying to do kind of public interest work that doesn't pay the same level as a firm job. So sometimes you have to go with what people care about, which is the money or whatever else. But if it gets them to agree that more affordable housing is necessary, sometimes that's what you have to do.
Can I add one thing to that, because it ties to a comment that one of our watchers asked about? I know a community in Pennsylvania that got its first affordable housing because the local hospital understood that they needed to support affordable housing near the hospital so that the hospital workers could have a place to live and that they could afford. So, community hospitals can be partners in the fight for affordable housing because they need places for people to live close to the hospital. That's not, 40 miles away down the highway. There are other people that can be, and other organizations that can be valuable partners in this effort, including individual employees within government who can be, with whom, if you get to know them, will work with you to try to develop change. But it just takes a lot of people working together in an organized way within the framework to make change happen. Look for your allies. Look for your natural allies, and don't think about it as just the people who show up at the rallies. Think about it as the people who are faith leaders, who used to be the leaders in every civil rights thing that I ever did in the 70s and 80s. Look for your leadership from your churches. Look for the people who are natural leaders in their local communities, the school principals who know the problems their kids have. Look for allies, wherever you are. If you talk about it, you'll hear who's with you on this, and you can bring them into the partnership.
And if you're familiar with the recommendation, you already have asks that you can make. You won't necessarily be stuck with the response from elected officials of, oh, we'll look into it. And, we know about this issue, but we're not quite sure what to do. We're evaluating steps. You can say, look, Habitat for Humanity has 5 different things that you could do right now to address affordable housing crisis. This analysis of impediments that you hired somebody to spend 2 years writing has pages and pages of recommendations. You could pick any one and start from those. So you have the tools, and if you build the community, then you're right there ready with the ask and say, okay, this is something y'all could do today. This is something y'all could do a year from now. And you've already, you've taken one step away from them that they have to do. And that one barrier that is taken away from that they could put in between you and what you're asking for.
And I would just add to that comment, throughout the state, each of the organizations should stage committees to review, evaluate, and read these planning documents, okay? The planning documents dictate how development happens in your community for a period of 5 years. The comprehensive planning document, 10 years, your land use plans. Formulate committees to be able to review and read these documents and give report outs. At the end of each consolidated annual plan, they have an annual action plan that they have to engage in every year. And that action plan is reported out on in what's called a consolidated annual performance evaluation report. Lots of acronyms. Don't worry about that. Read the documents, hold the jurisdictions accountable. They're required to report out on meaningful, measurable actions that have been identified in those plans. And you should see that. And if you don't see it, you should say something. Amtrak has a motto that I use all the time. I've stolen it from them. I'm probably going to get charged or something. But if you see something, say something. That's the only way you'll bring about change. And so I encourage you to create committees to be able to read those documents and be able to give some interpretation of those documents to your organization so that you can formulate a strategy to be able to address some of the systemic changes that are needed in the state.
I just want to make one quick plug. So I'm part of the Sussex Housing Group, and we are it's pretty much, I want to say conglomerate, but it's a group of nonprofit, for-profit, and private companies who are interested in housing or social justice issues. And we have an advocacy committee. So I cannot agree more with you guys about how important the coalitions are. That is the one thing that I have learned throughout my entire time in advocacy is you can't do anything alone. So you need to have that coalition with you.
Absolutely. So Dawn's given me a note here that we're having such a robust discussion amongst ourselves. I need to turn to the folks who are on the line. So we want to open it up for questions. So feel free to ask questions and we'll direct it to each or one of the panelists.
Okay, so we do have a few questions and I'll ask them and any of the panelists can answer the questions. First question is, has the situation with housing within the context of racism improved? If so, how?
So I'll start a little bit on that and say the studies that HUD has done every 10 years about the status of and extent of housing discrimination show that racism in housing, racial discrimination in housing is alive and well and continues to be a significant factor in people's experiences. The racial discrimination that occurs in housing is sometimes openly racist, and sometimes it is more subtle and hidden, but it is still amounts to racial discrimination, and it occurs with continued high levels of frequency in both home sales, in loans, and in rentals. Now, it's not always identified or reported because either it's not identified by the people who experience it, or it's something that they make a decision on that they're not going to pursue. We would encourage people who encounter housing discrimination of any type to contact HUD or the Delaware State Human Rights, is it the Human Rights Commission here in Delaware, to talk to them about filing a complaint, because it's only when people become aware of the situation and bring it to someone's attention to have it addressed that we can start the really tough job of rooting out racial discrimination and racism in housing. it's still a factor in people's lives and in experiences. And it's a factor as well in actions by government in deciding where they're going to cite affordable housing because of perceived assumptions about who's going to live there. So racism is not, we're not done with racism. We're just barely on the way to starting to address the way in which racism has been embedded in our communities.
And I would just add that in terms of Delaware specifically, there's housing discrimination, racial housing discrimination that is occurring every single day. And it's still overt in some cases. I mean, we, spoke to legal services providers who are hearing of overt discrimination, but it's also taking different forms. Now it's looking like overly restrictive credit screening, right? Or as Katie mentioned, voucher discrimination. We're also the concentration of affordable housing, as Sara mentioned, or criminal background screening, which has disproportionate impact on people of color. We heard that from folks who work in reentry issues in the state. So even if you're not hearing necessarily that someone was called a racial epithet when they tried to rent an apartment, we know that there are these policies that are having a disproportionate impact racially throughout the state.
And I'll just close the gap on that response. Nationally, HUD logs about 10,000 housing complaints a year. In this region, in this year alone, up from October 1st to current, I'm taking in over 1,200 to 1,500 calls, running the gambit from race discrimination claims, disability claims. And so it, as the panelists have mentioned, it is alive and well. I'll just add that our new president issued a memorandum on in which directing housing and urban development to take up the mantra of addressing systemic patterns of racial discrimination in this country. And so the notion that our president has deemed it necessary to issue a memorandum to direct HUD and other federal agencies to address systemic institutionalized racism means that it's here and that we have to take a bold position to do something about it.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Second question. So there are organizations and faith communities who want to help individuals being affected by eviction, trying to pay their bills, but they don't know how to go about this. Do you have any advice for these organizations and faith communities?
I would say first, as Sara mentioned, faith communities can be really powerful advocacy allies. I mean, they can lobby local government, city councils to provide additional relief to families. But the one thing I've been saying, every time someone asks me about this, especially during COVID, people really just need money. They really need money to pay their rent. We have eviction moratoriums that my colleagues describes as Swiss cheese. There's holes everywhere, and people can still be evicted places, and people also don't always have the legal experience necessary to fill out the declarations and proof that's required to avoid eviction. People just need money to pay their rent. They need money to pay their bills. Even though I do this work all day, I contribute almost daily to like mutual aid funds and things like that, just so that people have the money that they need to survive. Because if they're not getting it from the government, they have to get it from somewhere else, or people are at risk of eviction. So
you can push. Used to, when I was a legal services lawyer a few thousand years ago, county governments and city governments had rental assistance programs where they could go and make a one-time support, financial support for to pay rent for a month where somebody just couldn't pull it together to prevent eviction, or to help someone with a deposit so they could rent a new apartment because they were their prior landlord was going to remodel and kick them out, whatever it was. Those rental assistance programs can still be funded with community development block grant funds. But if you don't have that, you need a systematic way to work with social workers who can make those funds available on a case-by-case basis. And it is money. I agree completely with Sara W. It is money. It is to pay the rent. I have a friend who was evicted from public housing because she had to choose, before I met her, I have to say, between paying her utility bill and paying her rent. And she picked the wrong one. She paid the utilities to keep the heat on. And because she didn't pay the rent, she got evicted from public housing. I knew her because of her son, who came and lived with a friend of mine just so he could finish high school when his mom had to move out of town and live with relatives because she was evicted. I mean, this story is repetitious. It happens all the time. If you've got money, if you've got a faith leadership who's got some money for this, I say contact someone who is doing social work in a public, probably in a public government kind of setting, to see how they can best use those donations. That's what I would do.
I also just like to add that a lot of times people think that if someone is on the verge of being evicted, it's because they owe thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. There are people evicted. I mean, one of the recommendations I think we made in this AI is that people can't be evicted for back payment of less than $100, because there are people who were being evicted over sums of $25, $50, $75. Now with COVID, that might be a little bit different, but if you're thinking about this long term, you don't have to be making thousands of dollar grants to folks. A lot of times people can get by, at least for the month, with a much smaller money.
So I spoke to a group of judges and legal aid lawyers in Philadelphia and told them that they absolutely should not evict for back rent during COVID. They should not. They should direct the parties to negotiate an adequate repayment plan and keep the person in the unit, and a repayment plan that the people can actually make the payments on, that is a reasonable repayment plan, even though it takes a few months to do it. I mean, there are many solutions short of eviction right now, and nobody should be out on the streets at this particular time. Nobody should.
Agreed. I'll just add as well, the Eviction Lab that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation is a very resourceful link that everyone should take a look at. It gives you the statistics by any state, and it gives you the statistics for the state of Delaware, but it also links you to information that the state has regarding evictions and resources. And I think Katy mentioned it in her presentation, the CARES Act funds. Each state and community development office has received large amounts of money to do just that, to be able to give some relief to individuals who are facing eviction. And I strongly encourage everyone on this call tonight, reach out to the Delaware State Housing Authority and find out exactly how the funds are being dispersed, access to information. Can they make that information more readily available to the different jurisdictions throughout the state so that people have it? I think a big issue in the state is the lack of information and the lack of accurate information that people receive. So I encourage you all to reach out to the Housing Authority, check out their website, check out the Eviction Lab, and it will give you some resources and information on what's happening in evictions, the backlog of evictions. It's a wealth of information. And then I'm going to give a shameless plug to Community Legal Aid Society here in Delaware. They do operate throughout the state. Their Class C is represented in Sussex County, in Kent County, and in Newcastle County. Reach out to them. They're doing work on evictions. And so they can be very helpful in coaching and talking you through that process and what should happen and what should not happen.
And also, if you wanted to learn more information about other organizations or maybe even other faith communities who are also helping individuals affected by the pandemic for evictions or mortgage assistance, you can call 211 and they can connect you with those organizations if you wanted to talk to them. So maybe you can donate to their funds or something like that as well.
Okay, and that was 211?
211, yep, it's through the United Way.
So the chat room has information about the Delaware State Service Center's Emergency Services Program, where you can partner for donations for rental assistance. It's great.
So I know we're not going to get through all of these questions, but I'd like to get through a couple more. People are really interested in this topic and we're getting a lot of responses. So now in the CARES Act, there was a moratorium on foreclosures. However, many people just got further and further behind. Is there any proposed legislation to forgive some of that deficit?
I will, just from a federal perspective, I can speak to that. Again, we're on the cusp of a new administration, I will say that. And I think forthcoming will be proposed executive orders that will give greater direction to moratoriums, extending them, greater information on how forbearances will play out. So I would say stay tuned. I don't think right now the administration has been able to, in the first 100 days is what we're tracking. And so there are executive orders that are out there, but for sure, there's more to come. And so I would just say stay tuned. And as you know, as a regional director working with HUD, as information funnels through our office, we'll make sure that we funnel it through the Alliance, the League of Women Voters, and others that are part of this call.
I would also add that I think this moment has shown a need for more than, I mean, at this point, people are thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars behind, and a lot of people are never going to be able to pay that back. I mean, quite simply never. And I think just like, there are now people advocating for canceling rent, not just pausing rent payments, but full out canceling the debt that people owe in terms of rent. I think the same thing needs to be done for mortgages. I mean, there's really no other way to make sure that we don't have another generational housing going forward after this pandemic. If you saddle people with that type of debt, families will not recover for generations. So it's not just, there is no legislation now. The Lawyers Committee worked on Representative Omar's rent cancellation bill that was introduced last year, and I believe she's going to reintroduce it again. But there has to be more than just a pause on evictions and collections, because the money is piling up and people quite simply don't make enough to ever pay it back. So I think that we have to be looking at more extended types of protections for folks.
So I know we're getting close to our end time here, but just a couple more questions. Is there any kind of partnership between housing programs and employment opportunity programs? Because if you think about it, no job equals no home. So are there any partnerships between the two? Anyone aware of any partnership between housing programs and employment opportunity programs?
The only one that comes to mind off the top of my head, and I can't remember the name of the organization, but it was an organization that worked with folks who are in recovery. And so they had kind of a coordinated services model where they helped connect people to social services, such as disability benefits or something like that. They helped people secure housing. They also helped people secure employment. So I think there are definitely more opportunities, but I think a lot of places that we met with who provided social services were looking at doing kind of a holistic services model, recognizing that, if you don't have housing, you may not even be able to get a driver's license or apply for employment or things like that. All these things are connected. So I think that's the one that comes to mind first, but there's a lot of opportunity for that type of coordination, whether it's actually providing those services directly and connecting people to services, or on the advocacy front and working together and saying, this is an issue that affects all of us and all of our clients.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I think we have time for maybe one more question. So one of our attendees is new to Sussex County, but they understand that there's a lot of land that's being developed is owned by private citizens, not the government. So is it possible to get for-profit developers to build affordable housing?
So I'll take a stab at starting the discussion on that. So the short answer is yes. Both for-profit and not-for-profit developers can make money in developing affordable housing. There are a lot of programs that allow bringing dollars to the table, including tax credits that allow the support of mixed income housing, where you have some that's market rate and some that's affordable all in one location. So it's not all low income housing, it's a mixture. But there are other programs as well. A well-known one is the state money that comes through the home program from the CDBG program, which allows development of rental and for sale housing in more rural areas outside of big cities. And so a lot of the developers, both for-profit and nonprofit, are now putting together financing packages. One thing that localities should think about is incentivizing the development of more affordable housing in local communities. They can do that in a bunch of different ways by subsidizing, by offering a lower tax rate for people who develop X number of affordable units, to donations of land, to defraying sewer line hookup costs, and a variety of other things to incentivize affordable housing developers to come into a community, including offering up land that might be available for affordable using that's owned by the city, or sometimes the school system has vacant land that can be used for affordable housing development. So there's lots of ways to do that. And there's plenty of opportunities for the development of affordable housing in this area. And there's funding sources, including the USDA program that Katie mentioned a few minutes ago.
And the Housing Trust Fund and the two ordinances that I mentioned. So the purpose of those is really to incentivize private developers, essentially, or nonprofit developers, to develop affordable housing throughout the county.
They do it all over the country. They will come here. In fact, they would love to come here if they think about it. Think about all the things that this area offers.
Okay, well, I think that we could go on for probably another 3 hours, but maybe we'll have to have a part 3 of this conversation.
That would be great.
So with that, though, I'd like to turn it back over to Charlotte King, so she can close us out.
Okay. I have to commend and thank the panel. You certainly brought us a wealth of information, and it all seemed very hopeful. I must say, in response to that last question, can we build affordable housing? Yes, we can. And we've worked closely with some private developers who want to build affordable housing, but are stopped. They're stopped by not being able to get the right waivers from, let's say, county government or city government. There are ordinances that prevent it. And they're also stopped by people who don't want affordable housing in their area. So I'd like to believe that the opportunities are there, but there still seems to be a good deal of resistance. However, we should close with hopefulness, because all of you bring many opportunities that we all need to learn about. I thank you very much, and I think Calvin's right. We may have to have a part 3, and I hope that you will participate. It's sort of sad to think that the problem is so large and so ongoing that we have to continue to a part 3 and perhaps a part 4. But on the other hand, all of you are there pushing something which is so very important. So thank you. And I thank those of you who have been participants and listening and asking questions. And we'll see you at our next town hall meeting. Thank you. And Calvin, thank you for that, as usual, that wonderful video. I hope lots of people get a chance to I know you're going to put it on YouTube, that people will get a chance to hear all of you again, because it will be on our YouTube channel.